Following on Jim Bessen, Jim is one of those unusual people who spans both the academic world and the real world. Being the CEO of a company, a startup, dealing with issues such as software and development, both as an academic but also as an entrepreneur and as a business person. So that kind of spanning that interface, and I think there are various people here in the conference who also have that kind of experience, bringing intellectual ideas into actual practice, and then also experience and practice back into the academic arena. So there's two tremendous contributions. Jim's work also has been not only cited, but also influenced decision-making at both at the level of the White House and the US Supreme Court. So you just don't get any higher than that. So,
nice done.
Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Jim. No, after. Jim, if you'd like to present, and I'll
Sure.
call you up here later.
Clicker somewhere?
Yes, you've got your clicker here.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Your microphone ready?
Yep. Hi. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk in a little different vein about startups. There's a lot of literature tying startups to the innovation of a region. Evidence that the most innovative regions have a healthy startup economy. And there's good evidence, a bunch of research tying the creation of startups to local clusters. The idea is that there are clusters provide agglomeration benefits, knowledge spillovers, for instance, or they provide deep markets in the supply of talent, skilled workers, or in the supply of specialized inputs or customers in specialized markets. And these are all things that are beneficial for startups. And so we find that startups tend to be created in clusters. There's a lot of policy making that is geared towards encouraging the creation of clusters to develop startups and spur this economy. But we also find evidence to the other side that while clusters may benefit the creation of startups, they may also, in some cases, hurt the performance of startups. There's evidence that in some industries, startups created in clusters tend to survive less. They have slower growth. They're less likely to get to the IPO stage. And so there's a dual-edged effect going on. I'm going to talk about why it may be important to look within clusters in terms of not just the characteristics of clusters themselves, but actually for the role specifically of large clusters, of large companies within clusters. So the idea is that much of the agglomeration benefits come from big firms within clusters. And when you look at regional policy making, much of the effort to spur, to create the next Silicon Valley, regional policymakers try to provide tax incentives and whatever to attract large firms to locate within their clusters. And those agglomeration benefits stem largely from, or significantly from, the big firms within a cluster. I guess I've said some of this already. But there's a downside in the fact that big firms may also crowd the market. So while startups may be attracted to the talent that's available in a cluster, the role of big firms, too much hiring by the big firms, may possibly crowd the labor market for startups and make it more difficult for them to perform once they've been created. So we've all heard about the war for talent. The business press is talking about, and startups talk about how difficult it is to compete for talent, particularly top technological talent in STEM occupations or sales occupations or management occupations. There's a so-called war for talent. So what is crowding and what role can it play to the extent that there is more intense competition within a cluster? It means that startups have to pay more, which reduces their profits, which may reduce their ability to raise funds and grow, and it also may slow the hiring process, making it longer, taking longer to hire key personnel. So the big firms play a dual-edged role. While they bring spillovers, they bring some of the agglomeration benefits, they also compete in labor markets. And so there's this real two-sided characteristic to the role of big firms within clusters that's important to understand, and getting the balance right may be important for creating the next Silicon Valley. So the research question is, do in fact large firms crowd out startups? So I'm going to show you some research we've done recently that lends to this, but I think the bigger message I'm trying to convey is that looking at what's going on within clusters, particularly the role of big firms, may be important to understanding the nature of clusters. So why are large firms particularly significant when it comes to thinking about crowding out? Well, one is large firms hire some of the same types of occupations that a startup need, particularly technological startups. They're hiring STEM workers, they're hiring managers, they're hiring salespeople. Also, it's long been known that there's a large firm wage premium. Large firms pay more. There's a variety of theories about why that's true, but what it means is that when large firms are hiring more, that it particularly intensifies the labor market competition. Also, there's evidence of growing markups, meaning the prices that large firms charge tend to be higher than their costs, and those have been rising, and that means, though, that when large firms come to the market, they can afford to pay more for talent. So they become more aggressive competitors. What's the significance of this to startups? Well, it means that startups have to pay more when they hire. It means, as I mentioned, they can have slower growth and worse outcomes in terms of surviving, in terms of successful exits. And we're going to see evidence of all three things. So there's quite a bit of literature that's relevant to this. We know that startup hiring is key to startup growth. We know that agglomeration benefits attract startups. We know that startups sometimes perform poorly within clusters. And we know that large firms the presence of large firms does tend to raise local wages, but it also tends to attract startups. So there's this, this dual-edged thing where large firms may spur the creation of startups, but may also make it more difficult for them to grow. What do we find if we look within regions, when large firms tend to hire more, startups have to pay more. They have slower growth and worse outcomes. But there are a number of things that temper that interaction, and things that may be key to molding successful policy at the regional level. One is these effects of crowding are weaker when employees are more mobile, when they can more easily change firms. So things like occupational licensing or covenants not to compete may affect the mobility of workers and thus affect the impacts of crowding. Second, the crowding effects are much weaker for firms that are very close in business to the business of the large firms. This we take as evidence of spillovers, knowledge spillover. So in other words, a large firm comes into a region, it's going to affect the startups that are distant from it in other industries, in other technology areas, much more than it's going to affect the ones that are closer. And third, we find that big firms that have higher markups, that are charging higher prices relative to their costs than others making extra profits, those particularly have stronger crowding effects. Those firms tend to pay more, compete more aggressively, therefore in the labor market, and provide more pressure on the startups. All right, so this is a quantitative work. I'm going to just sort of briefly go through some of the key ideas. We have a model. The idea is that workers have different preferences as to whether they'd like to work for a large firm or a small firm. Large firms offer security, a long-term career. Smaller firms may be risky, but on the other hand, benefit from the potential upside. Workers at small firms may have greater independence, so some people like that better than others. Big firms have better amenities. So these differences cause differences in the nature of competition. They soften the competition in a way. But what happens is large firms may receive productivity or demand shocks, things that cause them to want to hire more. When they hire more in a local area, it affects the wages that startups have to offer in order to compete, and that reduces startup profits and hence slows startup growth. We look in this model. The model tells us that greater mobility lessens the effects of crowding, that technological or business proximity also lessens the effects of crowding, and that markups make it worse. Okay. Excuse me. All right, so what data do we play with? Two and a half main databases. One is we use the Crunchbase database, which includes we count nearly 150,000 startups. These tend to be technological startups. We're not talking about new restaurants or grocery outlets. The second thing is we look at ad postings. So Burning Glass, which is now called MC, has collected extensive data on online advertising, job advertising. So we have some 180 million job ads for the US that we're looking at. And these include not only the location, many of them include salary offered, skill requirements, education experience, et cetera, and even specific skills. And then we look at big firms, which we take from the CompuStat listings of publicly listed firms, those with more than 1,000 employees. We've done matching so that we can look at a startup in Crunchbase and find its ads in Burning Glass. We will be making the linking of these databases public so other researchers can do the same thing, which I think will be a valuable resource. We do tie in some other data. So for local labor markets, we define them by commuting zone, which is a local region that census researchers have developed. We pull in data about minority and women-led startups. We develop measures of markups from CompuStat financial data. We measure proximity in business terms by using the business descriptions and doing a text analysis, looking at cosine similarity between the words used between basically we have a pairing between every big firm in a region and the startups in that region, and we can find in a technology space the closeness of their businesses. The basic idea is that for each year, each commuting zone or local labor market, we measure the big firm share of advertising. That's the BFS. The big firm share is our key independent variable, and we relate it to, I can't really point here, but we can do a standard wage regression where we're regressing the wages offered against a flag, whether it's a startup, against the big firm share and interaction of those terms, and then a wide variety of controls, including startup and year fixed effects. So this provides us a way of measuring the impact of the big firm share of hiring on startup wages. The idea is that exogenous shocks to the big firms cause them to hire more, which then affects startups. But that is confounded by other sorts of things that go on, for instance, commuting zone shocks that may cause both local big firms and startups to hire more. To control for that, we use an instrumental variable strategy, a shift share approach. So what we do, I won't go into the details, but the basic idea is when we're looking at the big firms, we look at how the big firms have each year changed their hiring in other labor markets, and we use that to construct an instrument which we then apply to the subject labor market. So it should be independent of the local shocks, but nevertheless give us a measure of changes in big firm behavior that are affecting startups in the subject labor market. There's good evidence that big firms, in fact, do tend to change their hiring nationally rather than in local markets only. That there's a correlation between what happens in one labor market and another for the big firms. It turns out that this is, in fact, a strong instrument, and so we use it. All right, so what do we find? So I'm going to show you a bunch of regression tables, but the thing is, overall, big firm hiring. So these regression tables have standardized coefficients. So when you see a 1.87, that means that when the big firm that's in terms of standard deviation. So a standard deviation increase of the big firm share increases the average salaries offered by almost 2%, is what that means. So we're seeing for all types of firms, when big firms increase their hiring, the wages offered by other firms of all types goes up. In the third column, we look at just the startup flag, and startups pay a 9% wage premium. But in the fourth and fifth columns, which is the OLS and the IV estimates, we find that when we interact the startup term with the big firm share, we find that while other firms are paying a roughly 2% wage premium when the big firm share increases by a standard deviation, the wages paid by startups goes up about 4%. Why do startups react more sensitively to the big firm share? Probably because the big firms are hiring more of the key types of occupations that the startups want to hire. So in particular, if we look at the occupations, if we look at managerial, STEM, or sales occupations, we find that these have the biggest impacts from big firm hiring. And here the wage, basically what this says is that when big firms increase their hiring by a standard deviation, we're seeing a 5 to 10% wage premium that the startups have to pay. That's a pretty significant boost. I should mention that these regressions all include controls for education, experience squared, part-time flags, industry, occupation, commuting zone, and year. So there's lots of other factors are controlled for. We can also measure more directly the impact. We can get an intensive measure of big firm hiring. Rather than looking at the share of big firm hiring, we can look at what are the wages that big firms are charging. And we do this by first emphasizing doing a Mincer wage regression. That is, we regress the big firm wages against a whole standard of characteristics. 10? Okay. Education, occupation, and so forth, and we can get the residuals, so we're finding out, to what extent does the big firm pay above market wages. When we do that, we also find a significant effect on the big firm residual on startup pay. Again, it's greater for startups than it is for non-startup firms, about 3% by this measure. But we can also break out that residual into a markup term and a productivity term. So, you might think, okay, the big firms are hiring more because they have greater productivity, and in some cases that's going to be true. So big firm hiring isn't such a bad thing. You want the most productive firms to be the ones that are hiring. But if big firms are charging markups because they have, say, greater market power, that means they're able to pay higher wages without a productivity benefit. So we break up the residual into a productivity term and a residual term, and we find out that the markup term is very significant. So it turns out that when markups increase, big firm markups increase by a standard deviation, that startup wages increase by about 2%. We also find that greater mobility means less of a crowding effect. Okay, so the idea is then, okay, we're seeing big firms are raising wages for startups. What does that mean for the startup? Well, one, it means lower profits. If pay goes up 5% and the startup is charging 15% margins, that's a third of their margins go away. That's a very significant drop in profits. And that drop in profits mean that investors are going to be less interested in investing in this startup, which may slow their growth. Also, the greater hiring by big firms may mean that search times are longer, that it takes longer to find the key employee the startup wants to hire, and so that can also slow the growth of startups. So we look at the growth of advertising as a key metric for the growth of the startup. And we'll look at some other things in a minute. But the basic idea here is that when startups have to pay more, in other words, their wage residuals go up, their growth, in terms of ads, the likelihood that they will advertise goes way down. So our basic notion is here that a startup is created. What we see in the data is that lots of startups don't advertise, or don't advertise at first and then advertise later. So the idea is that startups get created typically with a few employees that are recruited through networks, only when they reach some sort of viability, as they develop their business model, test their markets and whatever. Then they really start to grow, and then we'll see their advertising increase. So we look at We measure the effect of crowding on advertising growth in two ways. One is just the likelihood that the firm will begin to advertise, and then the amount of advertising they do once they begin. And basically we find that a big firm share has a significant negative effect on both of those. In the IV model, that hazard of placing the first ad goes down by 25% with a standard deviation increase in the big firm share. And once they begin advertising, the startups will advertise 14% as fewer ads with a standard deviation increase in the big firms. We can combine those numbers and we walk away with, oh, that's interesting, it didn't display. But basically, it corresponds to a 36% decrease in advertising. A standard deviation increase in big firm hiring means a 36% decrease in startup growth, measured in terms of ads. That's a pretty substantial hit to startup growth. Spillovers make a difference, so we find that this. I won't go through the math here, but basically we can rank. We can look at the effect between the quartiles which are closest to the big firms and most distant, and we find that the effects are much stronger, both in terms of salary, ad hazard, and ad count for the distant startups. But nevertheless, there are effects for the proximate or close startups. They're just not as strong. So it very much relies on how close the startups are to the big firms, and I forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, so I'm looking at here, we're talking about ad growth. We show that this does correspond very much to actual employment growth. So we have rankings of the startups in 2021, and we find that basically for every ad they've run for a job, there's 1.45 employees. This means they're doing some of their hiring outside of the online labor markets. Interestingly, we find that firms that are founded or led by minorities or women tend to have a much closer correspondence between advertising and the number of employees. We interpret that. There's a literature which shows that startups founded by women and minorities have smaller networks, so they have less hiring outside of the labor market, meaning they're more reliant on the online advertising market. And we can combine and relate all of we can relate the ad growth to a whole range of actual outcomes for the startups, whether they were funded, how many funding rounds, the amount of funding, whether their website is operating in 2021, whether they were closed, whether they were acquired, or whether they had an IPO. So all of those performance aspects are tightly tied to these measures of advertising growth. We do a bunch of robustness checks. I won't go into that. But the basic idea is that crowding has a big effect on the salaries paid and the outcomes for startups. It means a standard deviation increase in the big firm share raises startup pay 4% overall, but 5 to 10% for key occupations. It means a sharp drop in ad growth, and that it's modified by employee mobility, spillovers, and markups. What does this tell us about how we think about policy? Well, one is the challenge for policymakers is to, balance the benefits of big firms in a region with these crowding effects. One thing is that employee mobility helps. If policymakers can encourage employee mobility, they're going to lessen the effects of crowding. But another one is that industrial specialization probably helps. The effects of crowding are much weaker for startups that are very close in business to the big firms. If the region tends to be specialized, then that means that overall, on average, the crowding effects are going to be weaker. Of course, there are downsides to specialization, but there does seem to be some evidence that the most productive regions or most innovative regions tend to be the ones that are specialized. So the general takeaway here is it makes sense to look under the hood. Or I guess in England you're supposed to say look under the boot? The bonnet. The bonnet. Sorry. That you can't just look at what's happening at the cluster in aggregate, but what's going on within it matters. Big firms play a critical role, although it's a double-sided role. Thank you.